September 1957. A 17-year-old kid pointed a gun at Bumpy Johnson's face. Everyone expected the same ending, another dead kid in Harlem. But Bumpy didn't reach for his weapon. He smiled. And what he said in the next 60 seconds didn't just save that kid's life. It created the most dangerous drug lord in American history. His name was Frank Lucas. And this is the story of the test that made him untouchable. To understand what happened that night on 116th Street, you need to understand what Harlem looked like in 1957. The Harlem Renaissance was long gone. The jazz clubs were fading. The Depression never really ended for black folks. People were desperate, and desperate people make dangerous choices. Frank Lucas was one of those desperate people. Born in LaGrange, North Carolina, he'd watched the Ku Klux Klan murder his cousin right in front of him when he was 6 years old. His family's house was burned down. His mother worked 3 jobs just to keep them alive. Frank learned early that the world was divided into 2 types of people, those who took and those who got taken from. At 15, Frank made his decision. He hopped a Greyhound bus north with $20 in his pocket and a promise to himself. He'd never be poor again. He'd never bow to anyone again. He'd never let fear control him again. But New York City didn't care about Frank's promises. Harlem in 1957 was a war zone. The Italian mob controlled the heroin trade. The police controlled the streets during the day. And at night, one man controlled everything else: Bumpy Johnson. By 1957, Bumpy was 52 years old. He'd survived wars with Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, and the Five Families. He'd done time in Alcatraz. He'd built an empire not through random violence, but through strategy, loyalty, and a code that made him untouchable in Harlem. People didn't fear Bumpy because he was brutal. They respected him because he was smart. Frank Lucas had been in Harlem for 2 years. He'd tried everything: stealing cars, running numbers, working as a lookout for local dealers. Nothing stuck. He was always one step away from getting killed or arrested. He was hungry, not metaphorically, actually hungry. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. September 23, 1957, 11:34 p.m. Frank was standing on the corner of 116th and Lenox Avenue. Rain was coming down hard. The street was empty except for a few hustlers ducking into doorways. Frank's stomach was eating itself. He had no money, no food, no options. That's when he saw the midnight blue Cadillac Eldorado. It pulled up to the curb outside Wells Restaurant. The driver got out first, a big man with a gun visible under his jacket. Then the passenger door opened. Bumpy Johnson stepped out. He was wearing a gray suit perfectly pressed despite the rain. He carried himself like royalty. Calm, unhurried, untouchable. Frank watched Bumpy walk into the restaurant. He watched the bodyguard follow. And then Frank made a decision that should have killed him. He was going to rob Bumpy Johnson. Looking back, Frank would say he wasn't thinking clearly. Hunger does that. Desperation does that. But there was something else, too. Frank had spent 2 years in Harlem watching men bow to Bumpy, watching them step aside on the sidewalk, watching them lower their eyes when he passed. Frank was tired of bowing, tired of being invisible, tired of being nobody. If he was going to die in Harlem, he'd die making a choice, not starving in some alley like a dog. Frank had a gun, a .38 revolver he'd stolen from a drunk cop 3 months ago. He'd never fired it, never even loaded it until that night. He checked the cylinder, 6 bullets. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline. He waited 15 minutes. Then Bumpy walked out of the restaurant. The bodyguard was still inside, probably finishing his food. This was Frank's window, maybe 30 seconds before that bodyguard realized Bumpy was alone. Frank stepped out of the shadows. Rain was pouring. Thunder rumbled overhead. He raised the gun, aimed it directly at Bumpy's chest. "Bumpy, get in the car and give me everything you got." Bumpy Johnson stopped. He didn't jump, didn't reach for his weapon, didn't call for help. He just stopped and looked at Frank, really looked at him. Those eyes. Frank would remember those eyes for the rest of his life. Cold, calculating, but not angry, almost curious. "How old are you, kid?" Bumpy asked. His voice was quiet, conversational, like they were talking about the weather. Frank's gun was still pointed at Bumpy's chest. 17. That's a lie. You're what, 15? 16? Frank's jaw tightened. I'm 17, and I ain't playing. Give me the money or I'll shoot. Bumpy smiled, not a mocking smile. Something else, something Frank couldn't identify. No, you won't. Frank's finger tightened on the trigger. Don't test me, old man. I got nothing to lose. That's where you're wrong, Bumpy said. You got everything to lose. You just don't know it yet. Frank didn't understand. Bumpy was supposed to be scared, supposed to hand over his wallet, supposed to beg. Instead, Bumpy was talking to him like a teacher, like someone who cared. It confused Frank more than anything. You see that restaurant behind me? Bumpy continued. There's 50 people in there. Half of them work for me. My bodyguard's going to walk out that door in about 10 seconds. When he sees you pointing a gun at me, he's going to kill you. No questions, no hesitation, just dead. Frank glanced at the restaurant door. His hands were shaking harder now. Then you better tell him not to. Bumpy took a step closer. Frank should have pulled the trigger, should have run, should have done anything except stand there. But he couldn't move. Here's what's going to happen, Bumpy said. You're going to make a choice right now, a choice that determines the rest of your life. You can pull that trigger. Maybe you hit me. Maybe you don't. Either way, you're dead in 60 seconds. My people will hunt you. Your family back home will get a call saying you died trying to rob the wrong man. And that's it. That's your whole story. Bumpy was now 3 feet away from Frank, close enough that Frank couldn't miss, close enough that one bullet would end it. Or, Bumpy continued, you can lower that gun, come inside, eat something, and I'll teach you how to survive in the city, not as a thief, not as a nobody, as someone who matters. Frank's mind was racing. This didn't make sense. Nobody offered mercy in Harlem. Nobody gave second chances. What's the catch? Frank asked. The catch, Bumpy said, is that if you walk through that door with me, you work for me. You do what I say, you learn what I teach, and if you ever point a gun at me again, I won't talk. I'll just kill you. Do we have an understanding? Frank stood there in the rain, gun still raised, Bumpy Johnson waiting. The restaurant door opened. The bodyguard stepped out, saw the gun, and his hand moved toward his jacket. Bumpy raised one finger. The bodyguard froze. Bumpy's eyes never left Frank. Well, kid, what's it going to be? You going to shoot me or you going to eat? Frank Lucas lowered the gun. I'm hungry, Bumpy smiled. Then let's fix that. They walked into Wells' restaurant together. Every head turned. Everyone saw the skinny kid with the wet clothes and the gun still in his hand. Everyone saw Bumpy Johnson with his hand on the kid's shoulder like they were old friends. Nobody said a word. Bumpy led Frank to a corner table, ordered him ribs, collard greens, cornbread, and sweet tea. Frank ate like he'd never seen food before. Bumpy watched him, didn't eat, just watched. When Frank finally slowed down, Bumpy spoke. What's your name? Frank Lucas. Where you from? North Carolina. Why'd you come to Harlem? Frank looked up. His eyes were hard. Because down there, white men can kill you for looking at them wrong. I figured up here at least I'd die on my own terms. Bumpy nodded slowly. You got heart, I'll give you that. But heart without brains gets you killed just as fast. You tried to rob me with an empty stomach, shaking hands, and no plan. That's not courage, that's suicide. Frank wiped his mouth. Then why didn't you let your guy shoot me? Because, Bumpy said, leaning forward, I've been you. 30 years ago, I was a kid from South Carolina trying to survive in Harlem, desperate, angry, ready to die just to prove I existed. And someone gave me a chance. Someone saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. Bumpy picked up his glass of water. Now I'm asking you, what do you see in yourself? Frank didn't answer right away. He'd never been asked that question. Nobody ever cared what he saw in himself. I see someone who's tired of being stepped on, someone who's going to be somebody. I don't care what it takes. Bumpy smiled. Good. That's the first step. The second step is understanding that being somebody doesn't mean being the loudest or the most violent. It means being the smartest. It means playing chess while everyone else plays checkers. He pointed at Frank's gun still sitting on the table. You pulled that on me tonight. You know why you're still alive? Because I knew you weren't going to shoot. You know how I knew? Frank shook his head. Because, Bumpy said, killers don't announce themselves. They don't give speeches. They don't shake. "You're not a killer, Frank. And that's not an insult. That's a compliment. Killers are cheap. Harlem's full of them. But smart men? Men who can think 3 moves ahead? Those are rare. And that's what I'm going to teach you to be." Over the next 3 weeks, Frank Lucas learned more than he'd learned in 17 years. Bumpy didn't put him on the street, didn't make him run numbers or collect debts. Instead, Bumpy made him watch. Watch how deals were made. Watch how respect was earned. Watch how power was maintained not through fear, but through intelligence. Bumpy taught Frank that violence was a tool, not a solution, that loyalty was more valuable than money. That reputation was everything. And most importantly, that the game wasn't about winning today, it was about setting up tomorrow. Frank became Bumpy's driver, his assistant, his student. And slowly, people in Harlem started to notice. The kid who almost robbed Bumpy Johnson was now walking beside him, learning from him, being groomed by him. 3 months after that rainy night, Bumpy gave Frank his first real test. There was a man named Willie who'd been skimming money from one of Bumpy's policy banks. Everyone knew it. Everyone expected Bumpy to have Willie killed. Instead, Bumpy sent Frank, not to kill Willie, to solve the problem. Frank found Willie in a bar on 125th Street. He didn't pull a gun, didn't threaten. He sat down next to Willie, ordered 2 drinks, and talked. By the end of the conversation, Willie had agreed to pay back every penny he'd stolen, plus interest over 6 months. No violence, no body, no problem. When Frank reported back, Bumpy nodded. That's how you do it. You gave Willie a way out. Now he's not your enemy, he's your debtor. And debtors are more valuable than corpses. Frank had learned the most important lesson. Power wasn't about destruction, it was about control. 5 years later, in 1962, Bumpy went to prison. Frank was 22 years old. He'd risen through the ranks. He was running 3 of Bumpy's policy operations. He was making real money. And he'd earned respect not through fear, but through competence. When Bumpy got out in 1963, Frank was there, still loyal, still learning. But Bumpy's health was failing, heart problems, the streets were changing, the heroin epidemic was taking over, and Bumpy knew his time was running out. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack in Wells Restaurant, the same restaurant where he'd saved Frank Lucas's life 11 years earlier. After Bumpy's death, Frank made a decision. He wouldn't just continue Bumpy's work, he'd surpass it. Frank went to Vietnam, made connections with opium suppliers, cut out the Italian middlemen, started importing pure heroin directly from Southeast Asia. He called it blue magic. Within 5 years, Frank Lucas became the most powerful drug dealer in America. He made over $1 million a day. He had politicians, cops, and judges on his payroll. He lived in a mansion, drove luxury cars, wore mink coats to boxing matches. Everything Bumpy had taught him about strategy, loyalty, and staying 3 steps ahead, Frank used to build an empire. But Frank forgot one lesson. Bumpy had always said, stay invisible. Don't attract attention. Don't let ego make you a target. Frank wore that mink coat to the Ali Frazier fight. A detective noticed, started investigating, and Frank's empire came crashing down. In 1975, Frank Lucas was arrested. He faced life in prison. And in that moment, sitting in a cell, Frank thought about that rainy night in 1957. He thought about the choice Bumpy had given him, shoot or eat, die or learn. Frank had chosen to learn, and for 18 years he'd been unstoppable. But he'd forgotten the most important lesson: stay smart, stay humble, stay invisible. Frank eventually became an informant. He gave up corrupt cops. He served 20 years. When he got out, he was nobody again. Just another ex-con, but people still remembered. They remembered the kid who pointed a gun at Bumpy Johnson. They remembered the man who became American Gangster. And they remembered the test, because that's what that night was, a test. Bumpy Johnson saw something in a desperate kid that nobody else saw: potential, intelligence, hunger for something more than survival. And instead of killing him, Bumpy gave him a choice, the same choice every man faces: stay small or become something greater, live by fear or live by strategy, die forgotten or leave a legacy. Frank Lucas chose to become something greater, and for better or worse, he passed Bumpy's test. The question is, what would you have done? Would you have pulled the trigger, or would you have lowered the gun and walked through that door? Because in life, we all face that moment. That choice between desperation and discipline, between violence and intelligence, between reacting and thinking. Bumpy Johnson understood something most people never learn. The most dangerous weapon isn't a gun. It's a mind. And on September 23, 1957, he proved it. He turned a would-be killer into a kingpin. He transformed rage into strategy. And he showed that real power isn't about who can pull the trigger fastest. It's about who can see the bigger picture. That's the story of the night Frank Lucas tried to rob Bumpy Johnson, the night he failed, and the night he became somebody. If this story moved you, you know what to do. Drop a like, subscribe for more, share it with someone who needs to understand that every choice creates a future. And in the comments, let me know. What would you have done? Would you have taken the shot, or would you have chosen to learn? Your answer says everything about who you are.